Chicago is a city that understands power, a city built on industry, politics, and the art of reinvention. But in professional sports, reinvention can be dangerous because sometimes what looks like a rebuild is actually a rescue mission. And right now, one of the most turbulent brands in the Women's National Basketball Association is trying to do exactly that, the Chicago Sky. Just months ago, the franchise was riding a wave of national attention behind one of the most polarizing and visible young stars in basketball, Angel Reese. Her presence electrified the fan base. Ticket sales surged, merchandise exploded, media attention followed. But then something happened. A controversial front office decision sent Reese out of Chicago and into the hands of the Atlanta Dream. What followed was outrage. Fans questioned leadership, critics questioned strategy, and suddenly, one of the league's fastest rising franchises found itself in the middle of a full-blown brand crisis. Now, Chicago is trying something new, a three-part rebrand. A veteran superstar with corporate credibility, Skylar Diggins, a fearless competitor with cultural edge, Dejanay Carrington, and a rising star with style and youth appeal, Rickea Jackson. On paper, it looks like a contender. But this isn't just about basketball, because in the modern WNBA, players are more than athletes. They are brands, markets, signals. And the real question is not whether this roster can win games. The real question is whether this new trio can repair a franchise that may have lost its most powerful cultural asset. Tonight on Controlling Interest, Polysports Tea League, we examine the Chicago experiment, the front office gamble, and the brand puzzle that may determine the future of one of the league's most controversial teams. Because in sports, fans watch the game. Investors watch the numbers. But here, we read the tea leaves. The headlines say the Chicago Sky are rebuilding. New roster, new direction, new opportunity. On paper, the franchise may have quietly assembled a team capable of competing in the Women's National Basketball Association. 3 major additions have arrived in Chicago. Veteran star Skylar Diggins, a relentless defender competitor in Dejanay Carrington, and a rising young talent with style and scoring ability in Rickea Jackson. Taken together, the pieces look promising. A veteran leader, a defensive disruptor, a young offensive weapon. For most teams, that kind of roster reshuffling would simply be called an off-season rebuild. But in Chicago, the story doesn't end there, because every move this franchise makes right now is being judged through the lens of one decision: the trade that sent Angel Reese out of Chicago and into the hands of the Atlanta Dream. And that decision didn't just change the roster, it changed the emotional relationship between the franchise and its fans. For many supporters, Reese wasn't just another young player developing in the league. She represented something larger: energy, visibility, cultural relevance, the kind of personality that can transform a team from just another franchise into a national conversation. So now the Sky finds themselves in a strange position. They may actually have a stronger basketball roster, but they are also trying to rebuild trust with a fan base that feels like the organization dismantled something special before it had time to grow. And at the center of the tension is one man, General Manager Jeff Pagliuca. To supporters of the franchise, he is the architect of the rebuild. To critics, he has become something entirely different. A polarizing figure whose decisions have reshaped the future of the team, and whose reputation among fans have earned him the nickname that now floats through Chicago basketball conversation: the Devil. Whether the label is fair or not, the result is the same. A franchise caught between two competing realities, a roster that might be improving, and a brand identity that may still be unraveling. Because in modern professional sports, winning games is only half the battle. The other half is winning the narrative. And right now in Chicago, that narrative is still very much up for debate. So the real question becomes this: did the Chicago Sky make a basketball decision? Or did they accidentally dismantle one of the most powerful brand engines the league had just begun to build? To answer that, we have to look at what the franchise actually lost. If the moves made by the Chicago Sky were simply about basketball, the conversation in Chicago would be very different right now. Teams trade players every season. Front office reshuffle rosters. Veterans arrive, young stars move on. That's the normal rhythm of professional sport. But the reaction to the departure of Angel Reese tells us something else was happening here. Because what left Chicago wasn't just a player. What left Chicago was a brand. And in a modern sports league like the Women's National Basketball Association, brand power is becoming just as valuable as basketball talent. Angel Reese had quickly become one of the most recognizable personalities in women's basketball. Her presence reached far beyond the court. Fashion, social media, celebrity culture. A new generation of fans who were discovering the WNBA not just through the game, but through personality. Reese represented something the league has been searching for. A player who could exist comfortably in multiple worlds. Sport, entertainment, lifestyle. And when that kind of personality connects with a fan base, something powerful begins to form. Momentum. For a moment, the Chicago Sky looked like they had found exactly that. A rising young star in a major American sports city. A player whose confidence and visibility made headlines beyond the box score. But momentum can be fragile. And when the decision was made to move Reese to the Atlanta Dream, that momentum collapsed almost overnight. The backlash came quickly. Fans questioned the direction of the franchise. Social media erupted with criticism. And suddenly the conversation around the Sky wasn't about building the future. It was about whether the organization had misread the moment. Because Reese had become something larger than a promising rookie, she had become a symbol. For some fans, she represented a new era of visibility for women's basketball. For others, she represented a confident, unapologetic personality that drew both admiration and controversy. But regardless of where people stood on that debate, one fact remained clear. She brought attention, and attention is currency that modern sport leagues depend on. So when the Sky made the decision to move on, they didn't just change their roster, they triggered a crisis of perception. The franchise suddenly had to answer a question that every modern sports organization eventually faces. What matters more, building the best team or maintaining a brand identity that draws fans to the team in the first place? That question now sits at the center of the Chicago experiment. Because the Sky are no longer just rebuilding a roster, they are trying to rebuild something more fragile. Trust. Trust with fans, trust with the market, trust that the organization understands the cultural moment it helped create. And that brings us to the real tension behind the entire story. The Sky may have assembled a roster with serious basketball potential, but the question hanging over this franchise now is not about talent. The question is about perception. Because in today's WNBA, players don't just change teams, brands change cities. And sometimes that brand that leaves can be more powerful than the roster that remains. So if the Chicago Sky lost one of the league's most visible young brands, what exactly did they replace it with? 3 new players have arrived in Chicago, each bringing a different identity. A veteran leader, a relentless competitor, a rising style icon. But the real question is whether these 3 pieces together can do something very few franchises ever attempt. Replace a cultural phenomenon with a brand ecosystem. That's the experiment now unfolded in Chicago, and the tea leaves suggest it may determine the future of this franchise. If the story in Chicago were only about basketball, then this conversation would end with roster analysis, points per game, defensive matchup, playoff potential. But here at Controlling Interest, we follow a different trail. We follow incentives, because professional sports is not just about competition. It's an industry, and every major decision inside that industry sits at the intersection of three forces: talent, marketability, and revenue. So when the Chicago Sky reshaped their roster after moving Angel Reese to the Atlanta Dream, the organization wasn't just assembling a basketball lineup. They were constructing a brand new ecosystem. Instead of building a franchise around one cultural lightning rod, Chicago appears to be testing something different. A three-part identity. 3 players, 3 brand lanes, 3 very different audiences. Lane 1, corporate credibility. At the top of that structure sits Skylar Diggins. Few players in the Women's National Basketball Association bring the level of professional credibility that Diggins carries. She's a veteran star, a proven all-star, and perhaps more importantly in today's sports economy, a recognized national brand. For corporate sponsors, players like Diggins represent stability. They are experienced, media trained, and already familiar to mainstream sport audience. From a business perspective, that matters because established stars help anchor relationships with broadcasters, advertisers, and sponsors who prefer predictability over risk. In other words, Diggins brings corporate gravity to the Chicago experiment. Lane 2, competitive edge. Then there is Dejanay Carrington. Carrington represents something slightly different: intensity, defensive energy, and a personality that resonates with a core basketball audience. Every league has players who serve as the emotional engine of a team, players who embody toughness, players who bring authenticity to the competitive side of the sport. For fans who care primarily about the game itself, Carrington provides credibility. He signals that the Chicago Sky is not simply chasing attention, they are trying to build a team that competes. Lane 3, youth culture and style. And then there is Rickea Jackson. Jackson may represent the most intriguing part of this brand experiment because younger stars like Jackson connect with a completely different audience. Fashion culture, social media, the emerging generation of fans who experience sports through personality and lifestyle. The modern sports economy increasingly lives at this intersection. This is where athletes are not just competitors, but influencers, content creators, style leaders, players who can expand the cultural footprint of a league. Jackson brings that potential, and that makes her a key piece of the Chicago's new brand puzzle. Put all those identities together, and the Chicago Sky appear to be attempting something unusual. Instead of relying on one superstar personality, they are spending their brand across multiple lanes: corporate credibility, competitive intensity, youth culture appeal. In theory, that approach could broaden the franchise's reach. Different players connecting with different audiences, different sponsors, different media narratives. But theory and reality is rarely the same thing. Because the brand that Chicago lost when Angel Reese left Chicago has something that is very difficult to replicate. Concentration, one personality, one story, one cultural lightning rod capable of pulling attention towards a franchise. The Chicago Sky is now attempting something more complicated, turning 3 separate identities into one cohesive brand. And that brings us to the central economic question of this entire episode. Who benefits if this experiment works? The franchise gains stability. Sponsors gain multiple personalities to market. And the league gains another major media market with renewed visibility. But if it fails, the Chicago Sky may discover something that every modern sports organization eventually learns. Attention is easier to lose than it is to replace. So the real question isn't just whether Chicago can win games with this new roster. The deeper question is whether the franchise can rebuild its cultural momentum. Because somewhere in Atlanta, the brand that once energized Chicago is beginning a completely different story. And if that story begins to grow, the contrast between those two markets could become impossible to ignore. And that's where the tea leaves begin to reveal something even bigger. At this point, the question is no longer just about roster construction. It's about alignment. Because in today's sports economy, talent moves between teams, but brands move between markets. And not every market amplifies every brand. So the real test for the Chicago Sky isn't just whether their new trio can play together, it's whether their identities can live together in Chicago, a city with its own culture, its own expectations, its own history of how sport figures are embraced or rejected. Chicago is not a neutral environment. It is a legacy sports city, a city that has historically rallied around strong, singular figures, icons who define eras, players who become synonymous with the identity of the team. That matters because Chicago fans don't just support talent. They attach to presence, to personality, to dominance. And when that connection is broken, it doesn't reset easily. So now we examine the three pillars of this new Chicago experiment. With Rickea Jackson, the Sky have a player who can tap into fashion, style, and social media culture. But Chicago is not traditionally known as a fashion-first sports market. It appreciates style, but it does not necessarily center its sports identity around it, which raises the question, will Chicago amplify Jackson's brand, or will her influence need to grow independently of the market? Is the culture compatible? Now, Dejanay Carrington brings intensity, edge, and competitive fire. That aligns more naturally with Chicago sports DNA. This is a city that respects toughness, defense, effort, players who show visible commitment to winning. In this lane, there may be a strong cultural match because intensity alone does not always drive broad attention. It earns respect, not necessarily visibility. Are the sponsors there? With Skylar Diggins, the Sky brings in a player who fits comfortably within corporate sports culture. And Chicago as a major business hub can support that. Corporate partnerships, media presence, established brand relationships. In this lane, the fit is clear. But corporate appeal alone does not always energize a fan base. It stabilizes a brand. It doesn't always ignite it. Audience identity. Does the fan base embrace it? This may be the most important question of all, because the Chicago Sky are no longer presenting fans with one central identity. They are presenting three, and asking the audience to connect the dots, to build a new emotional attachment, to invest in a collective story after losing a singular one. That's not impossible, but it is more difficult, because audiences don't always bond with systems. They bond with symbols. And this is where the Chicago experiment becomes a true tea leaf moment. Because what we are watching may not just be about one team. It may be a preview of the next phase of the Women's National Basketball Association. A league trying to balance multiple identities, multiple audiences, multiple versions of what stars look like. The question is whether those identities can coexist within a single market, or whether certain cities will always demand one dominant voice. If Chicago's model works, it could signal a future where teams build multi-layer brand ecosystems instead of relying on one superstar. But if it struggles, it may reinforce something much simpler, that in sports, even in the modern multi-platform world, one powerful identity can still outweigh three complementary ones. So now the Chicago Sky stands at a crossroads. A stronger roster on paper, a fractured narrative in reality, and a market that is still deciding what and who it wants to embrace. Because the game being played in Chicago right now is bigger in basketball, and the outcome may tell us exactly where the league is headed next. The roster move is the headline, but the tea leaves suggest something bigger, because what's happening with the Chicago Sky may not just be a team story. It may be a preview of where the Women's National Basketball Association is going. A league no longer driven by basketball alone, but by the alignment between player identity, market culture, and audience demand. Chicago made a choice. They moved on from one of the league's most visible cultural engines in Angel Reese and replaced that singular force with a three-part structure. Skylar Diggins with corporate credibility, Dejanay Carrington with competitive edge, and Riakia Jackson, youth, culture, and style. On paper, it's balanced. In practice, it's an experiment. And experiments reveal truth. Prediction 1. Teams will begin making roster decisions based not just on talent, but on market compatibility. Because not every brand fits every city. And the teams that recognize that early will have a competitive advantage. Prediction 2. NIL-era athletes will continue to reshape the league. Players like Angel Reese are not just prospects. They are fully formed brands before they ever step onto a WNBA court. And that changes the power dynamic between players and franchise. Prediction 3. Some markets will evolve into brand ecosystems, while others will remain dependent on singular stars. And the divide between those two models will define the next era of the league. The Chicago Sky is not just rebuilding a team. They are testing a theory that a franchise can replace one powerful identity with multiple complementary ones. If it works, it could redefine how teams are built. If it fails, it will reinforce something the sport world has always known, that attention is not easily replaced. This has been Controlling Interest, Polysports Tea League. I'm your host, Political Lil. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the devil in a blue mess, the Chicago Rebrand. And remember, in sports, fans see the games, investors see the numbers, but here at Controlling Interest, we read the tea leaves.